We're very honored and privileged to have with us a very outstanding, gifted physician, my friend, Dr. Sarah Schlesinger Hirschfeld, who is the Associate Professor of Clinical Investigation and Senior Attending Physician at Rockefeller University. Sarah, in our congregation, we have many gifted people in different fields. But we're so proud of you because in the field of research and medicine, you're outstanding. Having worked with a Nobel Prize winner in physiology, Ralph Steinman, and having conducted some leading clinical trials on vaccine for HIV. And also, you can answer a question that has been asked time and time again these days. Will there be a vaccine for the coronavirus that has impacted humanity throughout the world?
Thank you, Rabbi. First of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for including me in our wonderful congregation. I'm honored to be here, and you've asked a question that's near and dear to my heart. I've worked on developing vaccines primarily for HIV for most of my professional life. And the very good news among so much challenging news is I have great confidence that there will be a vaccine for coronavirus. Unlike HIV, which is a very difficult target for a vaccine, coronavirus is a pretty standard virus against which we know how to develop vaccines. There are currently, I think, 90 vaccine candidates, and that's a vaccine that's being tested already in the pipeline. There are, I think, 70 that are going to be going into clinical trials or in clinical trials in the next several months. And there are at least 3 and perhaps more by now that are already in human testing. Now, the challenge is, and all of this is wonderful news because each one is a shot on goal. We don't know which one's going to work the best because we don't actually know exactly what kind of immunity you need to induce. And we don't know which ones are going to be the safest and most well tolerated. The challenge
Sarah,
is time.
If I may interrupt.
Please.
What do we do in the interim?
Well, exactly.
And what is your timetable in terms of the discovery of the vaccine?
So to develop a vaccine typically takes almost a decade. If you compress everything until its very shortest time, you're looking at 18 months. There's an article that I shared with you, Rabbi, which you can share with the congregation that was in the New York Times that I think shows that timeline very clearly. Now, the good news is there are people testing a novel technology called RNA or ribonucleic acid, which is easier to make. And so a lot of the challenge in a vaccine is not just discovering what works, but then making enough for everybody. And so this is a much easier, sort of more nimble technology. And if that works, and that's what Pfizer is now testing in the United States in partnership with the German company. And I have no interest in any of these other than I just want a vaccine so I can get on with my life and get back to shul.
By the way, for the record, your talents have been asked to serve on the corporate boards of some of the major pharmaceutical companies. And again, you've devoted your life in order to heal and to save life. So I have to reward you for that. And I must say, your name really explains your commitment to your healing profession. Sarah was known for chesed, for loving kindness, okay?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Your parents must have really understood the future of their brilliant daughter. Okay, go ahead.
I had very insightful parents, and I'm grateful to both of them. I think my mother may actually be watching. I hope she is. If she is, hi, Mom. So the good news is that we will have a vaccine, but you asked the key question. It's likely going to be a while, realistically a year or even more. And what do we do between now and then? So the good news is knowing that there's likely a vaccine in our future, it means this is going to end. We will come through this to the other side. It may take some time, it may take a while, There's going to be a lot of pain in a lot of ways between now and then. But the other good news is there are time-tested, tried and true methods for controlling the spread of the virus. And we see that they're working. They're not pleasant and they're not easy, but our social distancing, our wearing of face coverings, and our attention to scrupulous hygiene all really work. I mean, if you look at the curves in the newspaper, on the news every morning, the curve in New York has been brought down. And that's not because the virus is burning itself out. That's because we New Yorkers are staying home. We're not going to shul. We're not going to work. We're not going to school. When we go out, we're covering our faces. We're staying 6 feet apart. And all of that is super hard. For me and for everybody I know.
Can you differentiate for us the difference between the various tests?
Sure. So the way that we're going to be able to see our way out of this before the vaccine is what's called test and trace. And so there's a lot of focusing on the tests, which I'll explain to because they are completely a balagan and confusing, even for people who understand them. But then there's the piece called trace, which means what do you do with that testing information? So there are two different things that are being tested. The first thing that's being tested is if you have the virus, or if there is some tiny bit of the nucleic acid of the virus in your body. And that's the test that you see all these drive-throughs with people with swabs up their noses. And that tells you if somebody has the virus, but it only tells you if they have the virus that day. You can be negative one day and positive the next. It's not a long-lasting state that it tests. That test is extremely important for people who are ill, for people in hospitals, for people who work in hospitals. It's also important to guide medical treatment. The second test is a test for immunity. So it's a test to see if your body has made a response to the virus. And that's called a serum test. That's the little blood test that you see. And that can tell you if you've been exposed to the virus and you've made an immune response. Now, the tricky thing, there are two really tricky things with that. The first is we don't know how much protection having an antibody gives you. For viruses, we know a lot. The Rabbi and I were earlier talking about measles. There's a published curve. I can tell you exactly what level or what range of levels you need to be protected from infection and what level you need to be protected from disease. And those are two different things. We don't know that for coronavirus. And we're a little worried, or more than a little worried, because other coronaviruses don't have very long-lasting immunity. But the good news is it looks like the preliminary data is, particularly among healthcare workers who get sick, get better, and then go back to work, they are not getting reinfected. And some of the problems with interpreting all of this data have to do with what is the other challenge with testing. And that is, how accurate are the tests really? Is a positive and is a negative a negative? So if you test for this, you do the serum test, the FDA has allowed something on the order of 90 different of these tests to be distributed and without the usual vetting. Only 3 of them, the ones from Roche, LabCorp, and I forget the other third big testing organization, they have demonstrated to be in the range of, well over 99% what's called sensitive and specific. And that means when a positive is a positive, it's right. And when a negative is a negative, it comes right. So for right now, that serum testing is useful for understanding how the viruses move through populations, because there's a lot of asymptomatic infection and asymptomatic spread, and that's very important to understand. But for any individual, we can't allow it to dictate behavior. So if you got it, if I found out tomorrow, and I fortunately have not had what I think to be a COVID infection, but if I found out tomorrow I had an antibody, it wouldn't allow me to do anything differently from what I'm doing today.
Now, you have done a great deal of research in terms of immunity.
Yeah, that's what I spend most of my time on.
Particularly our parent body is very much concerned.
Of course.
The discrepancy in terms of vulnerability between the vulnerable older population and our children affected.
So, Rabbi, that's a wonderful question. And again, one of the silver linings of this virus, I am, as you probably know, an optimist by nature. And the two real silver linings that I see, the first one is you already asked, and that is that this is susceptible to making a good vaccine in less than 40 years. And I've been working on HIV vaccines for going on 40 years now. I mean, not me personally, but me and my colleagues. The other is, unlike many, many infectious diseases, including influenza, which seasonally kills tens of thousands of people in the United States every year. Everybody remember to get your flu shot. That's going to be particularly important this year. So influenza tends to be particularly damaging in the very young and the very old. So the deaths from influenza every year are typically in children and then in our elderly. For reasons that are not fully understood, this virus, thank Hashem, seems to be sparing children by and large. Children when they get infected, seem to get relatively minor cases. They get a little cold or an upset stomach, but they're not severely affected. The problem with children getting infected is my son, who's 9, has said to me, I'd get infected and I'd probably be fine, but when you took care of me, you might get sick and maybe you wouldn't be fine. And that's what happens, is that the kids get infected, they bring it home, and then they can infect more vulnerable people in their households. Now, if you had asked me this question last night, I would have felt very comfortable with this answer. This morning on the news, there was, many of you may have seen this, a news story about the observation that there have been 15 cases of what's called Kawasaki syndrome, which is an inflammatory disorder in young children. It's typically associated with a whole different virus, and some of the children who have it have tested positive for COVID and others have not. But the health department is putting everybody on notice to be particularly sensitive about that. If a child has a fever, stomach ache, and particularly a bright red rash, the red rash is pretty distinctive, to immediately seek medical attention, because it's a bad thing, but if treated early, it's quite treatable. And so, and it's not even clear that this is associated with the coronavirus, but it was.
Unfortunately, some of our members were afflicted with shingles. Is that the virus?
Yes, shingles is a virus. So shingles is the same virus that causes chickenpox. So when you get infected with chickenpox, it's called varicella. You get called varicella infection, as we were discussing earlier, Rabbi. In children, it's usually pretty benign. If adults get it, it can be worse. There's now a good vaccine for it. But what happens is it sets up housekeeping in your nerves, and you never know it's there. It's what's called a commensal. We live happily with it. It lives happily with us. And your immune system keeps it in check. But as you age and our immune systems aren't quite as sharp as they used to be, or you're put under tremendous stress, as many people know, shingles is often associated with stress, an intercurrent illness or something like that, then the immune system and the virus get out of balance and the virus activates again. And then that same virus that caused the chickenpox that you got as a child comes down the nerve and causes that awful rash.
Yeah, I've had the experience. So I had chickenpox for the first time at the age of 19, and they thought it was smallpox. It was horrible.
Really horrible.
I may as well give some medical advice. Anyone who has shingles and you recover, make sure that you still get the vaccine a second time. Am I correct?
Correct, absolutely. So the shingles vaccine is a relatively new vaccine. It started out, interestingly, as the chickenpox vaccine, and then it started to be given to adults to prevent shingles. The original vaccine didn't work too well. It worked okay, but not great. And they made a new one recently called Shingrix, which for a while was hard to get and now is available. And I'd strongly recommend anybody in our age group, over 50 should receive it to prevent that nasty recurrence. And even if you've had shingles, it's a good idea to get it. It's now, 2 shots, 6 months apart.
Various tests are available through CVS and some of the healthcare centers. Right. How does one obtain a test?
Well, so
in Manhattan, in New York City.
So I'm not, fully up to date on this, but my understanding is that all of the city MDs are offering them, as are the CVS, many of the CVS pharmacies. certainly I would recommend anybody who wants one, reach out to your healthcare provider. One of the things, doctors who aren't busy in the hospital treating people with coronavirus are not so busy these days. And a lot of the barriers to telemedicine, which have been significant and prevented it from moving forward, have now all of a sudden have been just released, with a stroke of a pen. So you can probably, exactly as we're Zooming, you can FaceTime or Zoom with your healthcare provider and get their advice on where's best to go.
Sarah, you said you're an optimist.
I am an optimist.
We're in the same class. As a Holocaust survivor, believe me,
I'm sure.
I have to be an optimist. Okay.
You couldn't be where you are today, Rabbi, if you weren't.
All right. So you and I have the same worldview and outlook. Okay. So therefore, I've urged all my colleagues and all our trustees and president and a wonderful team to plan for the reopening. The reopening of our synagogue and our school. We've done a great job, really. Our principal, Rabbi Arthur and Rabbi Rockland, we've done a great job in terms of teaching our children ongoing classroom instruction out of the classroom. The rabbinic team, the cantorial team, again, the program I started, faith and not fear. My question to you is, first of all, thank you for accepting my invitation to be a member of the advisory leadership committee for the reopening of Park East Synagogue, okay?
I'm honored, Rabbi.
So my question to you is, in planning ahead to reopen, and I hope it's sooner than later, I don't want to say L'Shana Haba, I want to have it before, okay? So what precautions should we take for the synagogue? What precautions should we take for the schools?
So first of all, this is a work in progress. How anything reopens is we're building that boat. So as you may have followed, Governor Cuomo, who I think is very well advised, has proposed 10 criteria for reopening areas of the state. But the key criteria for reopening anything is having the ability to test and trace. So you asked me about testing, which I think is a very complicated topic, and I still think I probably didn't adequately explain it, but I tried. But the testing is only useful if you can then trace. So what that means is if you test me and I come up positive, I immediately get sent home to be quarantined for 14 days. Not come in contact with anybody else, even my family members, go into a bedroom and close the door. And that's what is supposed to and really has to happen. But then the second piece is that there has to be contact tracing. And this is a methodology that was used during the 1918 flu epidemic and even before. And it works really well, but it's really hard. It's really tedious. And frankly, it's quite expensive because it requires a tremendous number of people. These are what are called the disease detectives. So you say to me, who have you been in contact with? Where have you been? Give me the contacts from your phone. Now that is a 19th century technology. And one of the things that's being pioneered in Israel, Israel, as many of you know, may know that they put the Mossad in charge of this, which in my mind, if you want somebody in charge of this, they're probably the best in the world. But South Korea has also done a good job of using technology for contact tracing. We're all carrying our cell phones with us, and they know where we've been. So in South Korea, if you've been on a bus and Mrs. Lee, who's been on that bus, tested positive, you'll get a test. It won't tell you who it was, but it will tell you if you were on the bus going south on the whatever street at 10 o'clock in the morning, you were exposed. You should immediately go and be tested.
Dr. Hirschfeld, you gave me a challenging halachic question.
And what is that?
On Yom Kippur, even Rosh Hashanah, we have 2,500 people in the main sanctuary, in the parallel service, the Persian service, the children's service, the youth service, okay?
Right.
So again, the question is, does everyone on Yom Kippur carry the iPhone? All right.
Right. Well,
so I have to get a ruling. I have to work on that one and study. Okay. But
Rabbi, that forgive me, is your department.
Okay.
I remember for Pesach, seeing that, I guess it was the Sephardic rabbis in Israel who said it was allowed to Zoom for the Seder. And, we had my mother at our table with my iPhone and a little propped up stand, which was not what anybody wanted, but was certainly better than nothing. So, how we're going to, and I think that, what you're suggesting is a metaphor for how we're going to adopt to save lives and use technology smartly. There are a lot of not just halakhic questions, but issues of privacy. And there are many people who are very concerned about Big Brother and would not be happy to think the Mossad knew where you were. But in this case, this may be what's required to really reopen things. And so the ability to test and really test and have those tests work and be reliable and be what's called point of care. So maybe everybody who comes in, to school will get, not a nasal swab because that's too invasive, but new tests have been developed where you spit into a little tube. And that test has actually been just licensed by Rutgers. And I think that's a hugely important innovation, not just because it's so much less unpleasant, but the swabs are in short supply. So this gets around that issue. And it also means that all those healthcare workers and all that PPE don't have to be used to test people. So you test people and you find out, and if somebody tests positive, they can't come in. They get home and they get quarantined and all their contacts get traced.
We have an additional problem, which I discussed with President Herman Hofberg and the Board of Trustees and Cantabene with the administration. And that is, we live in a time where security is a big question, all right?
Of course.
Like we have armed guards when we operated in full operation, okay? So that creates also an issue. You're gonna touch so many people, that means added security. Anyhow, I'm giving you a challenging homework assignment, but let's talk also about the school.
Right, but I think, Rabbi, with both, forgive me, with both the school and the shul, I think we have to, and we talked about this earlier. So there's this lovely Winston Churchill quote that I find tremendously inspiring. And forgive me for referring to my notes, so I want to make sure I get it right. And that is, now is not the end, and it's not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps, just perhaps, it is the end of the beginning. So we are going through something that is going to end, and it is going to likely end with a vaccine. And that is going to be, as I said, at least a year away. It may be 2 years away. Life will go back to normal. I wake up in the middle of the night and I comfort myself with that thought, but it is not going to be back to normal this September. I don't believe that school this year will look like school last year. It might be that the very little children, you asked me about school, who can't socially distance, who can't reliably stay apart from each other, can't come this year. I mean, that would be a great loss, but maybe the children in first grade through 8th grade can come, but maybe they don't come every day. Maybe they come on alternate days, because unlike the schools in the suburbs in many parts of the country where they can put up, additional classrooms, tents, or, when I was a child, they were called temporary classrooms. They were trailers. Those, we don't have a place for that. Where are you going to, maybe on the roof, but we don't really have a place for that. And people will still have to come to
we have the playgrounds, fortunately.
Right, okay, there you go. You'll have one temporary trailer there. Or maybe a tent it. I heard someplace that Stanford is thinking of putting up tents. But I think that this academic year is we're going to have to be very creative about blending the distance learning that we're all developing and learning how to do. And as Jacob told you before, it's not nearly as much fun as going to school, but kids are learning, and some more traditional in-person experiences, simply because of the need for social distance, the need for controlling the number of people. The other thing I think, and this becomes also a security issue, and it's interesting to me because I've been reading about this, that we, in our Jewish day schools haven't done this. Many schools, including public schools in the New York suburban area, don't allow parents or caregivers in the building. The children come to the door, they say goodbye, and they go in the door. And I think that something like that is also going to have to be included, because that eliminates a huge number of people. All those parents with strollers with littler children coming through the door. I think that's probably going to be another practice that's going to have to be adopted.
This would have a very serious impact on the nannies who usually.
Right.
Anyhow, my question to you is, having devoted your life to healing, to improving the quality of life of your human beings, faith, and I consider you a woman of faith.
I am.
How does faith impact at a time of a pandemic, a time of crisis? How does faith impact in terms of your research? Talk about it.
Well, first of all, as you say, I am a woman of faith. And certainly many of my colleagues are not, but some of my most treasured colleagues are. And I'm always moved to think of Dr. Joshua Letterberg. And Dr. Letterberg was, to say he was a mentor would be overstating it, but he was an idol of mine. He was the president of the Rockefeller University. He was the youngest man to be awarded the Nobel Prize. He won at 32 for work he did when he was 22. And he was the scion of a very important rabbinic family. And when he decided not to go into the rabbinate, he told this very funny story that when he decided not to go into the rabbinate, his mother put her head in the oven. But he was going to medical school. He was going to go to physicians and surgeons medical school. And so she took her head out of the oven. She said, you'll do the work of Hashem by healing. He dropped out of medical school midway through to pursue his research. And his research was groundbreaking. And he was the person who figured out that the way bacteria reproduce sexually. And this laid the groundwork for all of molecular biology and many, many other things. He did this work when he was 22. And he again said, and she put her head in the oven. But when he was 32 and was awarded the Nobel Prize and she joined him in Stockholm, she took her head out of the oven. He had redeemed himself. But he was a brilliant man, and he lived into his 80s, and he advised, I think, 8 presidents and he's the person we need advising us on this. And sadly, he's no longer with us. But he was a man of faith, and he spoke very eloquently about it. And listening to him helped me to crystallize in my own mind, my own feelings. And that is our work. So you've been very generous to say I'm a healer. I'm really more of a scientist. I certainly have spent part of my career healing individual people, but what I spent most of my career is exploring the mysteries of the biological universe and learning how to use them to heal a large number of people, how to both treat and prevent disease. And I believe, anybody who looks in a microscope and sees the beauty of the universe contained in a microscope, I think it's very hard to not have a belief in a higher power and a creator. And I think when one is doing this work, so much of it, there's so much luck and fortune and intuition that goes into what we do. People think of it as being cut and dried, but it's not at all. I never can help but feel that there's a greater power at play. And, when it doesn't work, and when it's scary, and when it's frustrating, and when you're seeing people die, that's when perhaps faith is most important. So, with these moments, as you said, I'm an optimist, but my beloved husband who's listening will tell you I'm not always optimistic about this. And I get very frightened and very worried, because my biggest worry is that our healthcare system get overwhelmed, right? Because if too many people get too sick, we don't have the resources to take care of them. That would, in my mind, be the greatest catastrophe for us all.
Thank
We
you
will
for
get through this, but in that moment, a lot could go wrong. So it's faith that keeps me grounded in those moments.
Thank you for sharing your emunah with us, because it's inspirational. And each one of us really like we need food, we do need that faith to carry on through the tests of life that we all encounter.
Yes.
It's not a straight line. Life is full of volatility. Life is ups and downs, ups and downs. How do you manage? How do you cope with it if you have faith? Otherwise, you panic and, God forbid, suicide. You don't want to go that way. So emunah is very critical. And I want to actually speak about each one of us can really respond to the call from Hashem for tikkun olam, Tikkun Olam, that's the purpose of each one of us on earth, to build a better world for our children and our grandchildren. And that's exactly what you and Ellie have done. You in your field, Ellie in his.
Thank you.
God, the blessings that God has bestowed upon you, you have used that, utilized it in order to improve education. And that's why we were so honored to really recognize you for your commitment as patrons of education. And Hashem should really reward your Masim Tovim, and only much nachat from Jacob, Abraham, Jacob, and all your children. But I do want to just conclude by saying that, again, the frustration. We want to remember a loved one, as we do every Saturday at Parkey Synagogue, dedicating the Kaddish to those who observe the art site during the coming week. We pray for the recovery of those who are afflicted with illness. And then the question is, how do I observe a yard site? How do I observe a yard site? So I'm going to send out a guideline so that you know exactly what to do. Recite the Kaddish, recite the Psalm. And what I'd like to do, Elizabeth, is going to remember her beloved father, John Nordman, the yard site tonight. I remembered him quietly when I went through the entire list on Shabbat, remembering those who are no longer with us and their parents. So I would like to dedicate this very inspiring program that you and I had tonight to her father, John Nordman, who was a great leader, devoted his life to build the Jewish community of Switzerland as president of the Swiss Federation of Jewish Communities. And again, keep in touch with me, with Rabbi Goldschmidt, with Rabbi Einzleiler, with Toby, and the unbelievable work of Count Benny and the administration, the principals who are keeping our children afloat. And as I said before, we are going to open up that Ner Tamid, and without fear. And I must tell you, we have a plan A and a plan B. So we look forward, Sarah, to your input.
Thank you.
Plan A, plan B, and very, very warm prayers for the refuah for your beloved mother, who must be very, very proud listening to the conversations we had. To all of you who came and listened tonight to this very, very insightful program, may Hashem protect you, and don't forget, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. You recite the Shema twice, morning and evening, you'll have pleasant dreams, no nightmares. God bless you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.